I started noticing them in the margins, not in the history books, not in the academic journals, but in the photographs. Old photographs, the kind with that sepia grain that makes everything feel both more real and less certain. Photographs of people, extraordinarily tall people, people who should not exist according to the comfortable story we have inherited about the limits of the human body. And then they were gone, not gradually, not through some documented decline in average height that we can trace through medical records. They simply stopped appearing. Somewhere around 1800, maybe 1850 at the latest, the photographic record shifts and the giants disappear. And the deeper I looked into that absence, the more it seemed to line up with something else this channel has already dug into. The rapid disappearance of Tartaria itself. The correlations are too precise to be an accident, and let me be clear about what I am actually looking at. These are not circus performers. These are not the rare cases of gigantism we still see today, documented and understood. These are individuals, often several individuals in the same frame, who appear to stand 7, 8, 9 feet tall, and who are photographed not as curiosities but as ordinary members of society, standing with their families, working on construction sites, wearing the clothes of soldiers, of farmers, of labourers, completely at home in their own time. I'm Julian Crane, an archaeologist the establishment pushed out when I started asking the questions my colleagues wouldn't. So on this channel, I dig up the history they left out. If that's the sort of thing you want more of, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get into the dark truth about why the giants vanished after 1800 and the mudflood cover-up that buried them. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Take a photograph from Siberia, around 1870. 3 men standing beside a standard doorframe. The doorframe itself is 12 feet high. I measured it against the known dimensions of the building, which still stands. 2 of the men are of normal height. The third has to duck slightly. He is wearing work clothes. He looks bored. This is not a staged photograph celebrating an oddity. It is a work crew. Take another image, this one from the American frontier, dated 1883. A group of railroad workers, 7 men, and 3 of them tower over the others by what looks like 3 feet or more. Again, work clothes, tired faces, the casual posture of people who are simply doing a job, not performing, not being displayed. And it is exactly the ordinariness of these pictures that makes their content so hard to sit with. And it is not only work crews. There are family portraits, the formal kind people sat very still for, where a father stands a clear head and shoulders above a wife and children who are themselves of perfectly ordinary height. There are men in military uniform, buttoned and belted and tailored to a frame that no quartermaster today would keep a pattern for. There are church gatherings and town photographs where 1 or 2 figures in the back row rise above the crowd like adults standing among school children, except everyone around them is a grown man. In none of these is the tall figure the subject. Nobody arranged the shot around him. He is simply present, the way anyone is present in a photograph of their own life, and that is the detail that will not let me go. You can stage a spectacle. It is very hard to stage a bored giant at the edge of a group photo, half looking away, waiting for the exposure to finish. Here is the strangest part. These photographs exist in relative abundance up to a certain point. Then they stop. Not slowly, not with declining frequency. They stop, as if a switch was flipped, as if the giants themselves were suddenly no longer there to photograph. Which raises a simple but critical question. Where did they go? And that is where the mudflood becomes impossible to ignore. We have documented the evidence for it before. Cities buried under meters of sediment, first floors turned into basements, streets razed, entire ground-level facades submerged and forgotten. Walk the older districts of 100 cities and you find the same thing once you know to look for it. Windows at ankle height, half sunk below the pavement, their tops peering out of the ground like something drowning. Grand entrance staircases that now descend to reach a door, when a front door was never meant to sit below the level of the street. Ornate ground floors that have been rebranded as cellars, their carved stonework pointing downward into the dark. The official answer is that cities simply rise over time, that street levels build up as one generation paves over the last, but not by a full story, not everywhere at once, not on the same schedule across continents that had no reason to keep the same schedule. A global pattern of what looks like a catastrophic burial event occurring somewhere in the mid to late 1800s, and the timing lines up almost perfectly with the disappearance of the giants from the record. Not close, not approximately, almost perfectly. So I found myself asking a different kind of question. What if the Mudflood was not just a geological event? What if it was a reset, a deliberate erasure not only of buildings and infrastructure, but of the people who understood them, the beings who could operate them, maintain them, explain them? What if the physical burial of the old world happened at the same moment as the physical removal of its guardians? Look at what survives, and look at what does not. We have the shells of Tartarian buildings, repurposed, renamed, their original functions obscured. We have the basement windows and the buried ground floors. We have the enormous doorways that now swallow a normal-sized person, that seem perpetually oversized, perpetually excessive for whatever they are supposed to be doing. What we do not have are the operators, the maintainers, the guardians. The giants are gone, and the operational knowledge of the civilization they served went with them. And guardians of what, exactly? Consider the architecture again, not just its scale, but its purpose. These buildings were not simply large. They were sophisticated in ways that seemed to exceed the supposed technological capacity of their era. Systems that looked like they were drawing power out of the atmosphere itself. Chambers built for harmonic resonance. Water and air circulation engineered into the structure. Stonework cut with a precision that modern engineers struggle to explain, let alone reproduce with the tools that were supposedly available in the 1800s. And all of it seems designed for operators who could work at a larger physical scale, which points to something specific. What if these giants were not just guardians of buildings, but guardians of knowledge, operational knowledge? The kind that cannot be written down or easily handed over. The kind that lives in physical presence, in demonstration, in embodied expertise. The official explanation collapses here. Because if these beings existed, and the photographic evidence says they did, then their sudden disappearance is a crisis for conventional history. You cannot simply lose an entire category of humanity without an explanation, without records, without documentation of a disease, or a war, or any of the ordinary mechanisms by which populations decline. Unless, of course, their disappearance was orchestrated. Unless someone decided they needed to be removed from history entirely. We have names and dates for the last of almost everything. The last wild aurochs, the last speaker of a dozen dead languages, recorded on a wax cylinder before the final voice fell silent. But the last of the giants, an entire kind of human being, has no last, no name, no date, no grave anyone will point to. Something that large does not leave without a trace unless someone goes to a great deal of trouble to remove the trace. And the deeper I went into the records, the few that exist, the more I noticed patterns of disruption clustering around this exact period. The mid to late 1800s were not just a time of political upheaval and industrial revolution. They were a time of strange silences in the record. Hospital records that abruptly end, census data that becomes inconsistent or is lost entirely. Whole years where certain kinds of documentation simply do not exist, not destroyed in a fire or a war, just missing, as if they were never created or were removed after the fact. Whole registers of births and deaths that thin out to nothing for a stretch of years and then resume as though a handful of pages had been lifted out of the middle of the ledger. Hospital and asylum intake books that run in a steady hand and then simply stop mid-decade and pick up again later with no note of what happened in between. In an age that was becoming obsessed with counting and cataloguing everything, with measuring and filing and stamping a number onto every living soul, the one thing that goes missing is the record of the people who would have been hardest to miss. The gaps are too consistent and too deliberate to be neglected, and where the documentation does survive, it often contradicts itself. Heights recorded in military records that seem impossibly tall. medical anomalies noted once and then never mentioned again, references to unusually large individuals that appear in one account of an event and are completely absent from another account of the same event. Now consider the photographs again, the ones that do survive. Many of them have been corrected in later reprintings, the scale normalized, the tall figures reduced to ordinary proportions through careful cropping, and in more recent years through digital manipulation. I have tracked down original glass plates and set them beside the published versions, and the changes are undeniable. Someone has been actively working to make these images disappear, or at the very least to make them look less impossible, and the effort is systematic. It is not random, it is not accidental. In one case I laid the glass plate beside the printed page, and the difference was almost comic in its crudeness. On the plate, a man in a doorway, his head near the lintel. In the print, the same man, the same doorway, except the doorway has been carefully shortened and the man brought down to match, the proportions of the whole building bent a few degrees to make one impossible person possible. Somebody sat at a desk and did that by hand. Somebody was paid to make a tall man shorter after he was already dead, which forces the question, why? Why would anyone go to that much trouble to shrink a dead man in a photograph nobody was supposed to look at twice? What does an old picture have to prove before it is worth correcting by hand, decades after the fact? This is where the mystery deepens into something almost unbearable. Because if the Mudflood was a global event, and the evidence strongly suggests it was, then its coordination implies something extraordinary. You do not bury multiple continents under meters of sediment through random geological processes, not simultaneously, not with the precision we see in the architectural record. And if the disappearance of the giants was tied to that event, then we are looking at a coordinated erasure on a scale that beggars belief. A global effort to remove not just people, but the memory of people, to scrub them from the photographs, from the records, from the collective mind. The logistics of that would require organization and resources that officially did not exist at the time. Think about the manpower alone. Someone has to find the photographs in 1,000 family albums and newspaper morgues and government files scattered across continents. Someone has to identify which ones show what they are not supposed to show. Someone has to reprint them corrected, recall the originals, and do it patiently enough that no one notices the seam. That is not the work of a single government or a single lifetime. That is the work of an institution with reach, patience, and a reason, operating out of sight across generations while everyone else was busy digging out and rebuilding. And the pattern repeats worldwide. North America, Europe, Asia, Australia. Everywhere we find Tartarian architecture, we find this same strange gap in the human record, the same window where very tall individuals simply vanish, not through war, not through plague, not through any of the mechanisms by which populations usually thin out, just gone. And the societies that remain behave as though they collectively agreed to pretend those people were never there, as if they were following instructions they did not fully understand, as if a script had been written and everyone had been handed their lines. The silence was deafening. And the uniformity of that silence, across cultures and across continents, is perhaps the most disturbing part of the whole thing. Come back to the technology for a moment. The systems built into these massive buildings, all of it required expertise to operate and maintain. You do not build a machine that's sophisticated and then simply abandon it. You do not create systems that complex without leaving behind manuals, training programs, plans for who takes over when the last operator dies, unless the knowledge was never meant to be written down, unless it was embodied knowledge held by specific individuals who could physically interact with systems designed for their scale. The absence of technical documentation might not mean the records were lost. It might mean there were never any records to lose. Giants, standing 8, 9, 10 feet tall, could reach components housed in ceilings that now seem merely decorative. They could work mechanisms built into architectural features we have since reinterpreted as purely ornamental. They could operate at a scale that finally makes sense of buildings whose proportions now seem excessive, wasteful, illogical. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The buildings were not oversized for human use. they were perfectly sized for their intended operators. And when those operators disappeared, the buildings became museums of a technology we can no longer access. Beautiful shells, housing systems we no longer understand, tended by custodians we no longer remember. Stand in one of these halls and look up at the height of the doors, the reach of the upper windows, the fittings set into the walls far above where any ladder would sensibly place them, and ask who this room was built for. Not for the people filing through it today, ducking through doorways scaled for something taller than themselves. The proportions only stop being wasteful the moment you put a 9-foot figure back into the frame. Then every excess becomes a measurement. Every decorative flourish becomes a control that someone could actually reach. Their disappearance turned functional technology into inexplicable architecture. It turned purpose into mere decoration and historical curiosity. And what haunts me most is not the presence of the giants in the old photographs. It is their absence from every current narrative. The complete and total silence about what should be one of the largest anthropological questions of our time. Where did they go? Why did they go? Who decided their existence should be scrubbed from the record? And I keep circling one thought. What knowledge died with the giants? We are told we live in an age of unprecedented advancement, that every generation improves on the last, that progress is linear and inevitable. But what if we are actually living in a dark age? What if the technology that was lost, the atmospheric energy systems, the harmonic architecture, the sophisticated understanding of how a building could work with natural forces rather than against them, what if that was superior to what we have now? What if we have been mistaking our recovery from a catastrophic loss for genuine progress into new territory? The buildings themselves suggest as much. They are more durable than modern construction, more energy efficient, more in harmony with the world around them, and they were supposedly built with technology far more primitive than ours, unless they were not. Unless the builders had access to knowledge we have lost. Knowledge that might have been held and passed down by the very guardians who vanished after 1800. We flatter ourselves that we are the most advanced people who have ever lived, and maybe we are, in the narrow ways we have learned to measure, but measure the buildings instead. Measure how long they last, how little energy they waste, how they seem to breathe with the weather rather than fight it. Then measure what we put up in their place, the boxes we throw together to stand for 40 years before we tear them down again. If that is progress, it is a strange kind of progress. It is the kind a man makes when he has forgotten he once knew better and is proud of himself for relearning the alphabet. The Mudflood, whatever it truly was, would have provided perfect cover. A catastrophe, natural or engineered, that literally buried the old world and forced the survivors to dig out, rebuild and reorient. In the chaos of a reset like that, memory becomes soft. The official story gets written by whoever comes out the other side holding the power and the resources. And if the giants were specifically targeted for removal, whether killed or relocated somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary society, the Mudflood would let you hide it in plain sight. You blame their disappearance on the catastrophe. You fold their absence into the general trauma of the reset. You wait a generation or two for the living memory to fade, and then you simply deny they were ever there at all. You rewrite the textbooks, you suppress the photographs, and you let time finish the erasure for you. I am Julian Crane. I do not have the final answers here, and I am not sure anyone does. But the questions are worth asking, especially the ones that make us uncomfortable. Why do the photographs stop? Why does documentation of extremely tall people vanish from the record after a specific date? Why does that disappearance line up so precisely with the Mudflood? Who benefited from their removal, and what systems of power were threatened by the knowledge they protected? Because the giants were the bridge between the old world and the new. They were the living connection to Tartarian knowledge, and when they were removed, however it was done, the bridge burned behind them, and we were left as technological orphans, struggling to rediscover what was once common knowledge to a vanished people. The buildings still stand, hollow and repurposed. The doorways still wait for bodies that officially never existed. And that absence, that vast echoing space where the giants should be, is itself the evidence, a negative space in history. A hole shaped exactly like the truth we are not allowed to remember. So sit with the emptiness for a moment, and then ask yourself the only question that really matters. What else have we been taught to forget? I'll see you in the next one.